of the lecture on culture. The lecture on culture, in a way, we can think about this pair as culture is the content that gets passed on from groups to groups within communities, within families, within a given society. And socialization and social interaction is the how that happens, right? So culture is the what gets passed on, and socialization, social interactions is the how that takes place. How does these all of these different elements of cultures we looked at last week, such as language and norms and values and ideas, know-hows, everything just sort of like that we teach our both our young children as they grow up, that we continue to teach each other as we sort of co-live in sort of similar society, or things that we need to learn ourselves as children or as adults if we move into different or new social contexts. And so socialization, social interactions is that piece. There's it's pretty easy to think about socialization in the context of children because those, if not that term sort of specifically, then at least sort of the process associated with that term is something that almost everyone can quite clearly see is happening among children. It is a big task. If you have younger siblings, if you have some, level of sort of memories from your early days of sort of being 4 and 5 and 6 and 7, you have children yourself, or there's other little ones in the family, or you've played a caretaking role, again as a babysitter or somebody who's looked after kids in a different context. You know that there's an enormous amount of informations and behaviors and conduct and things that children need to learn. And so obviously a big part of what we're talking about today has to do with what takes place in childhood. And that specifically gets talked about as child socialization. The part that's less obvious sometimes to some is that socialization as a process of this learning continues to take place throughout lives. As you move through different social contexts, as you move to a new university, for example, you move to a new city, you make a new group of friends, you join a new workplace where maybe you knew one or two people there, maybe you didn't, but you're joining in an existing work culture. Um, all of these become opportunities for new forms of socialization, where you're learning the new sort of taken for granted aspect of that social context, where you're learning how to like how people sort of interact, how they navigate, what are the expectations attached to how people speak, how people interact, how people dress. And that really kind of never stops. There had been for a long time less sort of attention on, for example, late life socialization, but that has become a growing field, both within sociology, also within psychology, to look at socialization in the later stages of life. And so, for example, folks joining, hobby groups, communities, elderly communities, retirement homes, that becomes a whole other layer, a whole other set of sort of learning that takes place in life. All of that fits within what we call adult socialization. So, socialization really is something that starts early. Some would argue it starts as soon as a baby is born. Others argue that there's some aspect of socialization that starts pre-birth. That the sort of the singing and the communicating to an unborn child is the earliest sort of aspects, low level, but earliest aspects of socialization. So it's a lifelong process, is really what we're trying to kind of communicate here. It happens throughout one's lifetime. It happens through social interactions that you have between individuals. And it is one of the key ways in which you pick up self-identity, in which you pick up your physical and mental and social skills in order to navigate all these different social contexts in your life. And really, and I've used this phrasing last Wednesday, when we think about human beings or humanness or human potential or what it means to be human, Oftentimes, that is a very significant way. That is the product. That is the endpoint of these process of socialization, ways of thinking, ways of talking, ways of acting, things that are really, really essential to allow you to navigate the world sort of around us. So socialization is absolutely sort of essential. It's essential for the individual to be able to have sort of a successful set of interactions with people around them, but it's also really, really essential for the society and the community and the group that you live in. It's really important that individual members become socialized, and we'll talk about lots of different examples, both today of what happens when they don't, and also that's really the focus of the last substantive week of the semester, which is on crime and deviance. What happens when individual members or large swaths of the populations are insufficiently socialized or not socialized in ways that are deemed to be sort of in line with the quote unquote good of society. So it's the stability, the functioning of society really relies on people walking around and not doing what they're supposed to do because of sort of the non-stop set of like fear of punishment. That's not the only motivator, but that to a large extent, you, me, the people you know, we've internalized a whole host of set of expectations of how we're supposed to navigate the workplace and the school environment and a set of sort of circles of friends and with our family and with strangers as we drive or bike or walk through the city of Toronto or anywhere else. So the kind of people that we become are really linked to the process and to the places in which we are raised. There's a different term to speak to this. I mean, this falls broadly under socialization, but for those of you interested in that particular aspect, it's also called subjectification, the process by which we become particular kinds of people. And so, in a different way, and I'm going to take a pause here, in a different way, that means that if you were born 50 years ago, or 200 years ago, or 2,000 years ago, and raised in a different historical period, in a different social environment, you would have quite clearly become a very different type of person. Who is you, what you think about who you are, what's important to you, what matters, what your dreams are, what your aspirations are, what your tastes are like, what kind of relationships you aspire to have, what kind of relationships you've built, all of that, every single aspect of that would have been incredibly impacted by the specific environment in which you were brought up and in which you operate. And so what that means is that the notion of sort of like what makes me me is intrinsically tied to the historical context and the social context and economic and political context in which I live. So again, how people talk, how people eat, how people make love, how people wage war, all of these are functions of cultures. And so because of that, they're functions of the cultural groups in which I was raised, in which I lived, in which I operated over the course of my life. Now, it's really important, that said, it's really important not um, to talk about culture as over determining every single aspect of life. Human development is not just cultural. And so it is useful here to take a pause and say, when we try to understand human beings, oftentimes, and then again, you hear this a lot as well in psychology, you have this sort of nurture nature pieces, right? You have, for the lack of better words, you have biology on one side and have society on the other. You have the pieces that are part of your genetic makeup, things that you were quote unquote born with. And then you have the society and the personal experiences and your family upbringing and the relationships the rich relationships that led you from infancy all the way to today to become the people you are. And both of these are important, and both of these have an impact when you try to understand human development. Now, this isn't a biology class, it's a sociology course. So our focus is on the nurture side. Our focus is on the culture side. Our focus is on the impact of society side. But that does not mean, as we focus on culture and we focus on society, that biology's got nothing to do with it. right? There is this subdiscipline, even within sociology, called social biology. Actually, it's not just sociology, but it's at the crossroad between sociology, oftentimes, and biology, that looks, for example, at how biology affects social behavior. Um, and you see in discourse, both in popular discourse, but also in scientific sort of writing, places where people talk about the co-impact of biology and society and how these influences sort of intermingle. So it's useful here, at least for a moment, to sort of pause on that. And that if it looks like you're in our own minds as we're talking about these issues, as you're reading on these issues, you're looking at your text, that we don't forget that the societal piece is not 100% of the picture. We don't are not born all as complete blank slate of the exact same shape, the exact same size, the exact same like configurations. And the only difference is the historical kind of social context. It's more complex than that. And yet, we have now hundreds of years of mountains of empirical evidence about just how much the cultural environment, how much the societal piece is impactful on who we are and how we think of ourselves, and on almost, if not all, aspects of what it means to be a human being. And so that is the focus of us here this semester in terms of the sociology piece. And I'll revisit the biology piece only a handful of times over the course of the semester, but we leave that work for other disciplines, leave that work for other people to engage with. Okay. At the heart of all of this, as the first sort of piece building block, is the idea of the self. And again, this just like when I talked about culture, and it's a high level of interest that we share between sociology, but not just sociology, and for example, anthropology and a multiplicity of other disciplines. We're not the only ones interested in the self. The self is a really significant concept in the discipline of psychology and in a host of other disciplines as well. The intersection between psychology and sociology comes together into what's called social psychology. And so the work on personality, the work on group relations, all the material that falls broadly under social psychology is really at the intersection between sociology as a discipline and psychology as a discipline. And so you have social psychology courses within psychology, and you have social psychology courses within sociology. And a lot of the content from today is really about that intersection because you have authors who train as either psychologists or sociologists or sometimes even philosophers who are really mining and writing and have empirical work that's done at the cross border. And the work on the self is really much a feature of that. We talk about the self, we think about it as the notion of sort of the self concept, how we think about who we are, not something that's there when we're born, not something that little babies have an ability to do. They don't differentiate themselves from their main caregivers, which is almost always, not always, but almost always their mother. They don't have a distinct sense of identity from their mother. That's a developmental stage that eventually they reach and realize, like, hey, listen, I'm a different person than this other being or this being that's here, that I'm spending all my time with, that's always sort of around me. The self-concept is all of our beliefs about who we are, all of our feelings about who we are, how we see ourselves when you say I am dot dot dot, and what follows that, right? I am what? I am, you think of yourself as athletic or as smart or as tall or as friendly or as somebody who has a lot of empathy. You think of yourself as somebody who's an extrovert or an introvert. You think of yourself as somebody who's bold and daring or sometimes more shy or fearful. All of these things are part of our self-concepts, how we see ourselves, how we feel about ourselves. Now, where things get sort of interesting for us, and again, from a social psychology personality perspective, is the formation of the self. right? The self doesn't, it develops over time. How we see yourself, and none of you need to be convinced of this, of course. How you saw yourself 10 years ago or 15 years ago would be probably very different than how you see yourself now, no matter what your age is, whether right now you're in your, you're in your late teens, in your 20s, in your 30s, 40s, or 50s. Our sense of self evolves over time. So while the self is our individual identity, it's how we see ourselves as separate from our family members, separate from our friends, separate from other people around us. It's what we see as making us sort of unique. That sense of self continues to change over time. But what does slow down is the pace of change. So the term for that, the term for like the slowing down of the pace of change is called crystallization of self-identity. So the years in between ages, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, like the pace of change is very, very, very rapid. That 10-year gap, that 10-year period, 10, 12-year period, there's far more sort of movement that happens in our sense of self than there is usually in the same 12-year periods between ages 35 and 47, or ages 50 to 62, or ages 75 to 87. But the change continues to happen. As I mentioned earlier, as you move into new lines of work, as you meet new people, as you get into new hobbies, as you make new friends, as you pick up new roles in life, of as a parent, as a boss at work, as somebody who picks up sort of different activities into adulthood, you can and you do go through a transformation about how you think about yourself. Parenthood, of course, is one that's well known. It's a really big sort of milestone for people. It's not bigger than every single one out there, but it's a significant one where for people, they think about sometimes the years before they were parents and years after they were parents. And part of that, one of the ways to analyze this is the transformation that took place in how they think about themselves and their identity. And like what's their identity today versus what it was 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years ago before they had kids. So the sense of self continues to evolve over time, but it does crystallize around the adolescence period, um, meaning that it becomes a little bit, the pace of change slows down. And there are some features of who you are and how you think of yourself coming out of the teenage years that may be with you for decades, and in some cases might be with you for the rest of your life. They become defining characteristics of how you see yourself, and they're things you carry all the way until you reaches not to be too gloom and doom here, but until you reaches the end of your life. Um, I don't want to do too much sort of heavy theory, but it is important to sort of talk about a little bit the different ways in which the self has been conceived. And so this is covered in your text. So I don't, I don't need to go into and do a 30 or 40 minute on this, but I do want to highlight some of the significant differences between Cooley, Mead, and Goffman, in a way that adds to what was in there and try to sort of make it a little bit more clear for everyone. So Cooley, Mead, and Goffman. Cooley and Mead, social psychologists. Goffman, sociologist, but again working in the same area. They all wrote within a sort of a 30-year, 30, 40-year span of one another between the early 20th century and sort of the middle to second third of the 20th century. Cooley, Charles Cooley talks, and his most famous contribution is this idea of the looking glass self. And really put simply, a really significant way in which we understand each other is how other people see us. So the looking glass self is this analogy that like reflected back to us is how our parents and our siblings and our friends and our teachers and our caregivers and other people in our life, especially early on. That's still true to a certain extent, as we get older, but this is particularly when we're young reflected back to us, how they see us really impacts how we see ourselves. So if people keep, for example, affirming to us how nice we are, how smart we are, how beautiful or handsome we are, then we have a really high chance of internalizing that, of like, this is how people see me. This is how people, this is how people view me. This must be how I am. And then we internalize that. And on the other side of the continuum, if people see us as and label us and talk to us as if we're stupid, as if we're lazy, as if we're unkind, as if we're unattractive, then that is also something we internalize. And so to a very significant extent, some of our earliest development of how we see ourselves is generated through the feedback loop that comes from others. Now, over time, that diminishes a little bit. And part of the reason it diminishes is that we become more secure in how we feel and who we are. And even if we don't get that validation from people, either at all or frequently, we may have a few people in our life who do give us that validation, who sees us the way we see ourselves. But even if a chunk of people don't, we can still hold on to this piece that says like, well, they don't know me very well, or like they're misunderstanding me, or they're misinterpreting me, or they're seeing only one aspect of me, but that's not really who I am. But the younger we are, the less that's the case, the more we are impacted by people around us. Now, Mead came in and said, okay, well, Cooley's onto something, but there's something else that's at play. And so Mead developed this system of the me and the I. And the me is this piece is that's similar to Cooley. It's the how other people see me. It's the voices in our head that we carry with us, that maybe it's those that voice of dad or mom or grandparent or not an uncle or an older sibling or friends that tells us like this that is with us. One way to think about it is similar to Cooley. Another way to think about it, it's all when we talk about crime and deviance later this semester, it's also like the piece that says like you shouldn't do that, right? People in popular culture will talk about like a little angel or little devils on their shoulders, or they'll use the word sort of around conscience, like guilty conscience, or the conscience is pushing you to kind of go and make decisions in particular directions. The me is like what we've absorbed from other people. It's not one person, that's why it's called the generalized other, but it's broadly speaking kind of the constellation, the amalgamation, if you will, of all of these different voices from people that are in our lives. It's us as an object. What does that mean? It's because like they're commenting on someone else. Like all those folks that know us, they're looking at us, we're external to them. They see us, they describe us, they talk to us like we're not them. They're describing something they're seeing at arm's length, right? It's like you describing a friend, or it's you describing a movie you saw, or you describing something you found. You're describing this external piece. In this context, we talk about that as an object. Mead, though, said there's another element to it. There's the self as subject, the one that acts, the one that says, yeah, I know that my parents or my friends or my older brother or sister would disapprove, but I'm going to do it anyway. Like, I know that people aren't going to be happy if I do this. I know that my partner I'm dating is not going to be happy if I do it. Maybe my teacher is not going to happy if I do this. But you know what? Like, I get to make my own choices, and in this case, I'm going to choose and I'm going to act in ways that I think like that makes me happy, or that I want to act. So individual impulses, individual agency, using terms we looked at the last two lectures, you as a subject that can act onto the world. Mead says that that part is also exists. And so there is this two pieces to us. We carry with us the judgment, the expectations, the friendships, the peer pressure, if you will, for lack of a better word, of all. I like expectations better, truthfully, as a term to speak to this, of everyone we know. And some of these are more important than others, if it's our close family or if it's our best friends. But we still make our own decisions. And sometimes that runs counter to what people want from us. So there's the me, but there's also the I. So these are the two pieces for me that makes the story about who we are and about the self a little bit more complex than what Cooley had. And then Goffman, a few decades later, adds another layer to it. And here, and this is a bit more provocative. I mean, lots of people like Goffman. Goffman is a Canadian sociologist, Canadian-born sociologist, but that probably became one of the most famous Canadian sociologists. He did most of his career is tied to what's called the Chicago School, the Symbolic Interactionist School at the University of Chicago. But Irving Goffman came in and said, actually, things are even more complex than how Mead describes it. And one of the things that Goffman wanted to say, and we're going to come back to Goffman at the end of this lecture, talking about the dramaturgical approach, but I'm going to focus here on the self piece. Goffman says, I don't know that there is a core essence, like true capital T U. I think that it's more useful to talk about us or who we are across and in different contexts. And so he talked about the multiple selves. And here's what he was trying to get at. If you are an individual who is or not you specifically, if there is an individual, I don't need to personalize it. If there's an individual who is at work all week long, works 40, 50 hours a week, and they are in a position of small amounts of power. Maybe they're a team leader or a director or manager or something like that. And they're rough on their employees. They're rough on their colleagues. They're unkind. They're unbending. They make life relatively to very miserable for the other employees that are there. Every day, the other people on that team show up to work, and it's not fun. It's not fun because of this person. And then they go home and they complain about the fact that they have a really terrible boss, that they wish they had other options, and some of them may be looking for work somewhere else. That's the experience that all of these people have of this person. But this is a person that does that because this is how they see their mandate. They're trying to get, squeeze productivity out of the team. They're trying to get projects completed. This is how they feel they need to act in order for these things to take place. But when they go home at the end of the day, maybe they have a partner and they have two kids, and they volunteer at a local organization, and they also coach the little league baseball team. And so at work, they're known as a jerk. They're known as an asshole. They're known as somebody who's sort of really kind of terrible to work with. But at home with their family or in the community or at the volunteering opportunity, like they're known as kind and generous and all of this. So Goffman says, well, what's the true self? And what value is it to say that somebody's true self is the one that people see at home when the real experience that a dozen or more people have of this person at work every single day is of one that's being really, really rough, really, really, really unkind? Um, Goffman says you can push this analogy even further. What about somebody who does bad things and hurts people most of the time, but internally they say, oh, I'm not really a bad person. Like I'm fundamentally misunderstood. And really, really, I'm a good person. Goffman says, what value does that have for us as social scientists, for somebody to believe they're a good person when every piece of evidence you can find is that they're making literally everyone's life around them miserable? So Goffman wants to move away from the notion of the true self and wants to move towards this idea that who we are depends on the social context we're in. And this is the link between this and the dramaturgical approach, is that we perform our different versions of ourselves in different contexts. We are not always the same self when we are with our very closest friend and people that we trust sort of fully versus when we are with our family. Let's say there's some more tensions or resistance or difficulties or challenges with different family members, and we might be different in a context where we're surrounded by strangers, and we might be different in a context where we're at work or we're at school. And to the extent that there's some traits that carry across all these contexts, there would need to be an acknowledgement that that stability across context does mean something, and it's worthwhile. But Goffman says a huge amount varies based on that context. And you think you know people, but then the context change, and then the neighbors or the family or the friends will say, "Oh, wow, we never saw this coming." Well, yeah, because they saw one aspect of this individual. They saw one version of this individual. They didn't see the other aspects that says like, wow, okay, when there was stress or there was this or there was that, like this person made difficult decision or maybe terrible decisions and then hurt other people. It's because again of this notion of the multiple self. So I could do a whole hour on this because I find it really fascinating. And truthfully, that was also really early exposure for me to sociology was the idea sort of Goffman. But the main takeaway here is that you have an evolution of theories about the self, meaning that social scientists who've been trying to make sense of what does the self mean, and again, psychologists have lots of different terms after that to kind of talk about different aspects of the self, including what Catherine's bringing up here, which is the notion of the working self. There's notions of self-esteem. There's lots of different pieces of the self that are meant to be this compartmentalization that it's not exactly the same, but it does fit neatly with Goffman's sort of push to sort of speak about the self depends on the context. Tell me what context we're looking at, and then when then the individual at work, the individual customer, the individual with friends, the individual with family, the individual as a student, the individual as a patient. Then we will see different aspects of this self and that is more useful and more interesting for him than to talk about whether my example from earlier, whether this person is really, quote unquote, a nice person who does maybe some not so nice things at work, or they're really an awful person, but who puts on a good mask or a good show when they're at home with their family. So he wants us to move away from that and then open up different opportunities for analysis because of that move. Now, the story about the self doesn't end with the late or the mid to late, mid to the 20th century, 1950s, 60s, which was when Goffman wrote. People continue to write about the self, of course, over the last sort of 50 years. Um, Bourdieu is one really significant author, and so I'm going to talk about him here. Um, he falls under the post-structuralists if we talk about her five sort of major sociological sort of perspectives that are present in every chapter of the text. And Pierre Bourdieu has been for several decades now, either the first or second most cited author in all of social sciences. This is not about sociology, but all social sciences. That doesn't mean he's the most genius who's come up with the very best work of any other scholar that's out there. Sorry, because a bunch of people who quote him or who reference to him are referencing him because they disagree with him. But it does mean that his work has had a really, really significant impact. And so I want to focus on one piece here, which is the piece the about habitus, the notion of habitus, because it's a more essentially it tries to modernize this notion of it tries to modernize this notion of Mead and this notion of Goffman um, in the context of the writing that Bourdieu did, which a lot of it started in the 80s, but a lot of it is in the 90s and the early 2000s. And so the notion of habitus is the key piece here I want students to be able to sort of take away. Habitus is a term that's really close to habit, but is not quite a habit. So, but think as a starting point, the notion of the word habit, and I'm ESL here, I'm hearing myself pronounce the word habit. It's not quite right. I'm sorry about that. But a habit is something the H word, is something you've picked up. It's something that you didn't always have, but over time you did. The first time you learned to tie your shoelaces, the first time you made yourself breakfast, the first time, the early days of certainly learning how to brush your teeth, the early days of sort of learning how to drive. Like at the beginning, none of these were habits. All of these were things you had to learn. but as you've done them and you've done them in a similar way over and over and over again, eventually you just develop it becomes like a second sense. It's something that you get to do almost on autopilot. You get to do it without having to think too much on it. It just happens because you're just kind of following the motions of what's taken place before. Now, habitus is close to that. The difference is that habitus doesn't speak to just like the sort of behaviors and the way you like your coffee, or the way in like that you like to go to get yourself ready for bed, or the way that you like to kind of talk to people. But it's broader than that. It speaks to how it also impacts how we see the world. It impacts our frame of perception. It means that it also includes that the way you make sense of the world around you, the way you're making sense of this class right now, the way you're making sense of world politics, and work yourself of sort of news affairs, the way you're making sense of what your friends are telling you on any given day, that these are molded on, they're built on like the same kind of principles as the regular use of the word habit. They're integrated into your frame of perception, your frame of reference. And unless something unusual happens, you are not on autopilot and you don't care, but like you're interpreting the world in ways that are very similar to how you were interpreting the world yesterday and a week before that and a month before that, build from the accumulation of these experiences. So our actions and our perceptions and our appreciations are all there. And while habits oftentimes is talked about like as a consequence of doing something repeatedly that becomes like sort of just a default, habitus is also generative, meaning it's also a cause. It's not just a consequence. It makes you notice certain things and not other things. It makes you pick up on certain aspects of what goes on around you that the word habit doesn't really normally have. So your individual history is sort of part of it, but it then becomes something that impacts how you see the world around us. So again, what are we talking about here? It's this idea that this disposition, and that's the everyday, more sort of English word that's the closest to Pierre Bourdieu's sort of notion of habitus, is that it's mostly learned unconsciously. It's mostly learned through your family and your education and your teachers and your friends. It's something that happens over time, but you're inheriting that from your groups, and then it becomes sort of second nature. So there's lots of examples. Um, the embodied sort of versions of this is the way in which we speak, the way in which we dance, the way in which we walk, the way in which we greet people. Um, like accents is a really interesting one, right? Like what accent you are perceived to have, what your accent you're perceived to have by other people around you is heavily based from your exposure to that language originally, or the mix between the language you first picked up when you were young to languages that you picked up later on, as an older child or as an adult. And that accent is that combination. It situates you, and then depending on what aspect we're speaking of, it situates you as having been raised in a particular place. And some people over time, with mastery, with time, with effort, can have that accent almost sort of entirely disappear, where they're naturalizing sort of this second or third or fourth or fifth language that they've picked up, where the fluency now is so high that the original accent is no longer there. But like those are oftentimes at the front end not fully conscious choices. These are things that sort of happen that are follow you, and as hard as somebody in the moment would want to knock off their accent of how they're speaking in a third or fourth or fifth language, it can't happen with like a switch, like a light switch that you can turn on and turn off. So that's a piece of it. And the same thing with, again, walking, dancing, these other kinds of the ways you greet one another. You can change them if you pay attention to them, but most of the time, these are things that are shared within groups that you've picked up from your upbringing and your surrounding, and then they are becoming sort of taken for granted. I've given some more examples here. that this also impacts like what you value, what you consider to be morally ethical, what your taste might be in particular kinds of popular culture, like movies and shows and music, the manners that you have, but also what you think is possible in the world. Like right now, sitting where you are or standing where you are, like what are the trajectories that you think are open to you in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years? Those are also shaped by those experiences, that those exposure to sort of family and education, your social environment, that leads to having particular disposition that says, I'm leaning towards a professional career. I'm leaning towards living my life where I want to have a place to stay, and maybe I want a family, and maybe I want a career that's satisfying, and that I will get both, good financial remuneration from it, but also that I will be fulfilled by. Having all of these aspirations are part of the dispositions that you're sort of working with. Um, is habitus basically a pattern of understanding the world around us based on consequences? Close, Katrin. Habitus is your Katrin's way of seeing and perceiving the world, shaped over time, slowly, but shaped over time by the conversations you've had, by the things you've seen, by the things you've read, by the interactions you've had with your family and with teachers and with your friends that have led you to see the world in particular ways. Now, you can decide one morning, you know what? I want to immerse myself into something else. I want to learn about a way of thinking and a way of being and a way of living that's completely, quote unquote, alien to me, that is completely outside of my comfort zone, that is something I know nothing about, that's something none of my family know nothing about. You can do that. That's the agency piece. But the disposition is not like determinative, meaning it means that you will 100% turn out exactly like other people before you. But disposition means is that you are more likely to see, to notice, to understand, to interpret the world in ways that are in line with how you've been taught, what you've been told, what you've been exposed to. It means that the barriers to express something else is a little bit more than that. So for newborn, habitus is just like self-concept. They don't have that at birth, but they'll have slowly over time. Yes, exactly. So for babies, what extent do babies have habits, like things that they do? Well, you could say when they're first born, okay, like there might be a handful of things there, and it's probably most easy to see that at the very beginning that probably isn't on the earliest days something that's an impact of sort of culture or sort of family upbringing, not at first, but soon after that, where patterns of sleeping and patterns of playing or patterns of eating, like already in the early weeks and the early months after birth, then being a baby in one family, being raised by one set of caregivers or parents versus someone else starts to have an impact on that kid. They start to develop sort of a habit. They start to develop sort of preferences for different things. And then that only becomes stronger and stronger over time. We are not talking about habitus in babies. For habitus, we're talking about like ways of understanding and conceiving of the world. We normally are, that's a stage of development where if somebody is able to think and ponder and look at and interpret things that are going around them a little bit more broadly than what we'd associate with babies. But it starts early, and then yes, it just picks up steam over time. The example I'm about to give will show you sort of when that happens. I'm going to use the analogy of soccer. And if you've ever seen 2, 3-year-olds play soccer versus 5 or 6-year-old play soccer versus what soccer looks like when it's played by 8 to 10-year-olds, you see that transformation very, very clearly of those different stages of development. So habitus, one way to think about it, one way that Bourdieu sort of described it, is what's called a feel for the game. Like acting in ways that are attuned to the context, attuned to the classroom, attuned to the game that you're playing with friends, without always having to consciously sort of think on it. If you're consciously deciding and you're making a pro con list, then that's no longer habitus. If you're about to go on a job interview, if you're about to go on a date, if you're about to do something you've never done, and you're weighing like how you're going to approach it, you're weighing the pros and cons of different things, you're really thinking it through, then that is no longer something that's done out of habit. That is no longer something that falls under habitus. That's something that falls outside of that, that now taps onto the novelty of the situation, and that taps into like a layer of reflexivity of like thinking and pondering and deciding and choosing carefully what you're going to do next. Habitus is used to describe the pieces that happens without that. The countless actions we take on any given day, um, that are not the result of this deep thinking pro con list, but are things you're just doing because you're trying to get from point A to point B, or you're moving through the motion of these conversations, you're moving through your work, you're moving through the motion of studying, of writing, of so on and so forth. That all falls within habitus. So I have a picture here of Christine St. Clair, a soccer player, most decorated women's soccer player who's now just sort of retired. And when we talk about habitus, yes, I'm into the sociology of sports, so that's my example here is going to come from that. The You developed over time all, so think about any, if you, it doesn't have to be a sport, it can be musical activity, it could be something that falls into the art. Think about something you've invested some amounts of time in your life so far, going from not knowing anything about it to practicing and investing time and getting better slowly. And then maybe there's nothing that you've invested, years and years and years of your life, but probably for many of you, there is, where over time, the idea of the repetition of practice, whether we're talking about piano or we're talking about soccer, the repetition of practice, of the kicking the ball, of the running, of the positions, of you're trying to get to a point where where we're playing this instrument or playing on the field becomes second nature. You are not at every moment, every keystroke that it's time to hit with your fingers, or every run or every direction you're going to take on the soccer pitch, that you are thinking about this as a pro con list, as a decision that you have to think, am I going to go right here or am I going to go left? The goal of all this training is that you're almost or less are going to operate on instinct by the time the game start, by the time you play. It's going to become second nature. The repetition, you've done the practicing and the practicing so that you turn all of these things into like something that's effortless, something that you can do with your eyes closed, something that you can do and you just feel where you're supposed to be at different points. Now, not everyone becomes the same. There's some better piano players, obviously, there's some better athletes, obviously, but this sense of the game, it's an embodied sense. It lives in the body. And I'm not trying to do like a mind body split here, but this is not a calculated, rational cost benefit analysis thing. It's a habitus thing of I know what to do. I know what to do without articulating it, without having to think on it super clearly. I can just go and do it. And in fact, if you stop me, if you stop me and you ask me to explain, then I have to interrupt what I'm doing and then I can struggle. In fact, many do struggle having to explain. Some great athletes and some great piano players, to use those two analogies, are not great teachers. It's become so second nature to them, their talent level and the way in which it's all been internalized over years, if not decades of work. They don't have the vocabulary because that's not usually how it goes. They don't have to think on what they're doing and explain it and have it make sense to someone else. This is not something that's part of it. Some are good at it. Oftentimes, the best coaches are not the very, very best athlete or very, very best musicians, but the ones who've had to struggle a little bit, the ones who've had to figure it out, the one who've had to like deconstruct it at least once in a while and get through those challenges and try to overcome it and kind of make sense. or the ones who have maybe not the highest level of competency or skill, but they have an ability to kind of articulate and communicate what they're doing and why they're doing what they're doing. So habitus, yes, habitus very much fits on the so Bode and Tegan's point about instincts and Catherine's point about the unconscious. Habitus is the feel for the game, second nature. It's something that you do out of routine. It's something that you do without having to think on it too much. And when you're confronted with thinking, when somebody asks you a question, why, Katrin, do you see this news story the way you do? Why are you reacting that way? And now you need to think on why. Why are you feeling the way you are? Why are you noticing this story in this way? Why did you pick up on these details and not these other details? Now you're forced to get out of habitus and to get into reflection and to reflect and communicate and articulate to someone else how things are being done. I could push this and push this and push this and talk about lots of other examples. Another one might be romantic relationships or really important friendships. People are around one another. They have this ebb and flow. They can read one another, but occasionally there's a gap and there's confusion or there's uncertainty or there's mystery that somebody doesn't like. And then one person wants that clarified, and then they ask questions, and then they want the other person to articulate why they did what they did, or why they're thinking what they're thinking, or why they're feeling what they're feeling. And now it's no longer habitus. It's no longer something that just flowed without thinking as sort of second nature, but now you're asking somebody to ponder on what that is, to come up with an explanation, articulate that. Um, and it gets more complex. This is a first year course, right? It gets more complex, but one of the ways in which I'm going to hit at this complexity is that researchers have found when you ask people for their opinion, they'll provide you with their opinion. But when you ask people why that's the opinion they have, they'll come up with dozens and dozens of rationalization, of justification or explanations, but it's not clear. The more you push them on it, the more that's really the reason. So essentially, what researchers like people doing Bourdieu's work have found is that people have these feelings, they have these beliefs, they have these dispositions, they have these preferences. But when you force them to articulate them and explain them, it's not clear that what they tell you is the actual real reason. And not because they're trying to lie to you, but because they don't always know. They don't always know why they leaned that way. They don't always know why they felt that way. They don't always know why they were geared towards this particular outcome. But if you're forcing them to provide an explanation, oftentimes they'll just provide you with an explanation, the one they think is right, the one they think you want to hear, the one they think is appropriate, the one they think is more palpable. That may not be the reason, but that's a reason they'll articulate. And if we mistake their explanation for the quote unquote real reason why they're doing things, then we're missing out on something. Then we're missing out on the idea that this wasn't a carefully planned, blah, 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 this and that, and cost benefit and weight all of this. It was more on the habitus sort of second nature piece of it. But you're forcing people to articulate. And so now you're providing explanations that may not be accurate, that may not be authentic to the moment. So that creates additional layers of complexity for social scientists trying to sort of make sense of the world around them, that the explanations people will provide you are not always in line with the reasons why, and the explanations why people do what they're doing. So somebody says here, I didn't catch the name because the post is a little longer. See about that. Can you go up? Can't see it. Compared to social muscle memory because it's deeply internalized automatic disposition, guys, I would perceive. That's very well put. That's another really nice analogy, like a social muscle memory. I like that. Absolutely. Okay, so we are at 10:10. Mindful of, let's take a 5-minute break, 10:10 to 10:15. I'm going to shut off my mic, give everyone a chance to rest their ears, and then I will come back and then we'll tackle the second half of the content today, shorter second half of the content today. Okay, I'll be back in 5 minutes. Okay, we were just talking about habitus and trying to anchor into a different example the notion of sort of disposition. And, in sum, how is it that we are disposed to, you could say predisposed to, enjoy different kinds of music, enjoy different kinds of food, predisposed to be good at different sports, disposed to be, really comfortable around strangers, disposed to be, fearful of math or statistics in any kind of, school setting. These dispositions are shaped by our past experiences. We carry them with us, but that doesn't mean that we can recognize their impact, B, make different kinds of decisions. Not to be, predisposed to sort of enjoying sport doesn't mean we can't meet somebody or make a group of friends or be invited on an outing and then have a really great time and then be surprised that, like, oh, I didn't know that I'd enjoy this, but now I do. And so that shifts slightly how we see it, how we understand it. Something we weren't a fan of. Again, each of you may be able to take an example of this. Something you weren't a fan of, or you didn't know very much about, or maybe you had some, you were predisposed not to like a particular kind of thing out there, but then you got exposed to it. Somebody introduced you to it, or you got an entry level sort of, engagement with it, and then you're like, you know what, this is not as bad as I thought it was. And maybe you go from that to now you have a bit more familiarity and maybe you really connect with it in some ways. And then suddenly something that you were not predisposed to be interested in is now something you're very much interested in. So these dispositions are there, but they shift, they change over time. They are not durable throughout our lives. They something that gradually sort of takes place over the course of our existence. And where and how that happens, part of that is the explanations around what's called the agents of socialization. I've spoken about this at length now without using that term. These are the individuals around us who impact our lives, who impact how we see ourselves, who impact what we pick on, who are involved in small t and capital T forms of sort of teaching us and passing on expectations to us. There's a couple of different categories that are discussed in your text. Everything that falls broadly under family or school or peer groups, mass media. There's a separate section around some aspects of socializations or things that happen along really specific racial, ethnic, cultural lines. And then there's a separate section, for example, on Indigenous people and socialization, trying to highlight that different people pass on onto the next generation, different things that are important to them. And so what do you have here? Sort of a table. While there's significant differences across the diversity of Indigenous people, both in Canada but in a global sort of aspect, there are some emerging themes, things that connect many of these groups with one another in terms of sort of major ideas and major things that are sort of important to pass down from one generation to the next. So I listed some of these here. For example, a stronger attachment to the land as something that's really important, being respectful of the land, having a relationship with the land as being core to one's own identity and way of life. A more collectivist, and again, this isn't Indigenous compared to any other group around the world. There's lots of places around the world where the collective has a greater importance than the sort of the Western mode that's more individualistic, but the well-being of the community as a whole, right? Like, how is the group doing? How is the well-being of the group as a piece? Regarding life and time as cyclical rather than linear, the idea, for example, of the medicine wheel, the interdependence of different pieces, the holistic nature of things even when it comes to health, but like come to us as an individual, um, and the community. Looking at things sort of much more holistically is certainly usually sort of part of it. The idea that there is, and this was more common, including in a sort of Western kind of context, but has been less the case for a while. But the importance that elders have as keepers of knowledge, keepers of tradition, wisdom, people to be looked on who have a really significant amount of status inside the social group. And so one of the things that's really interesting to look at is the way in which the status and the role and the social positions that the eldest in a given society have had over the generations and how some of that has shifted. And in looking, and this isn't the focus for us today, but looking at how the elder generations are treated inside Canadian society, and what role they occupy, and how that role different than it would be in other cultural groups and different than it would have been from an historical context. And then the idea of restoration. We're going to come back to this a couple of times, but especially when we talk about crime and justice a little bit later this semester. But the idea of restoration or repairing, right? It's not that there is zero aspect of sort of punishment, but there's oftentimes a greater prioritizing of how do we undo or how do we repair, how do we heal the harm that's been done. And so restorative justice is a really big category of justice. It's incredibly more prioritized within indigenous cultures than it is within Western cultures, and yet it's made its way in different ways within the Canadian criminal justice system, for example. So we'll talk about those examples, but really, the notion of restoration is really key. So these are some of the really large shared beliefs that get passed on through the process of socialization from one generation to the next within several Indigenous groups. That gets us to the idea that's touched upon also in your text a little bit on resocialization. Now, resocialization is oftentimes not the easiest for sort of students to understand because the gap between what quote unquote is typical socialization and re-socialization isn't always entirely clear. Resocialization is when a completely new and different set of values is being oftentimes imposed on an individual to replace their existing set of beliefs and values. So we are being socialized and re-socialized in a certain way all the time, again, as we move into different social spaces. But we normally hold the words re-socialization for a process that's more intrusive, for a process that's more systematic, and for a process that really seeking to replace what was there before. And so some of the examples for that is, joining a law enforcement agency or joining the military, where there is the goal of sort of oftentimes swapping out a set of values and norms and beliefs that an individual came in with and replace that by the institutional approved set of norms and values and belief that's really important, that's really core to that organization. You see that in the context of some cults. You see that in the context that gets talked about in the politicized way that when we talk about education. And so I'm going to pin that for now because we're going to talk about education more fully in a few classes from now. But it has become a contested ground where people are talking about like brainwashing or talking about ideological training or um, they're talking about like programming that happens in school. It's because you have sets of individuals out there, sets of parents and sets of community members who are very unhappy with the curriculum that happens in school, and so they see the instruction that students are being exposed to in school as an example of resocialization. You're trying to replace the values we've given our kids by another set of values that the state has decided instead. And you're absolutely right, Miles, 100% that a flagpole example of this is what I talked about last class, in very briefly in terms of the residential school system, where the goal very much was to replace a whole set of values and beliefs and tradition and language and behavior and swap those out, eradicate those, and replace those by the set of values and beliefs that was in charge felt were better. That turned out, should have known at the time, but that turned out to be a massive disaster for a whole host of different reasons. But that is very much an example of a forceful, imposed upon set of resocialization. And oftentimes, in order to achieve that kind of resocialization, you need people to be in what's called a total institution. You need to have people removed from their daily surroundings. You can't have it's not impossible, but it's very difficult to have this thorough system of resocialization if people are still embedded in their family and their friends, in their neighborhoods, in their surroundings. So not all, but almost all of these examples of quote unquote successful, I'm using quotes here, successful from a perspective of like those who are trying to achieve this resocialization, it requires isolating or removing people from their environment, which is what happens for cults, which is what happens for military, which is what people claim are happening for school in terms of creating a distinction, although that's the one that's more of an edge case, but 100% is what happened in the residential school context. So that's the resocialization piece. We've talked about the social interaction piece or the socialization piece a little bit. I need now to kind of focus or turn for the last 30 minutes on the social interaction piece. The social interaction piece the name of the lecture is socialization and social interaction. Sometimes they're treated as like two topics that are covered in sequence. Here they're being brought to kind of together because they have sort of many connections. So I'm going to shift focus on that for the last sort of half hour. Social institutions is something that's covered in your text. We use that term in everyday language to talk about the social institution of the family or of education or the criminal justice or the healthcare system. Um, the core social scientific definition of that is that a social institution is an organized set of rules and patterns and beliefs that are out there to organize, and that's the key word, to organize one aspect of society. So yes, education and family and the economy and the criminal justice system and health, these all meet those criterias. But the goal, the function of the social institution is to organize an aspect of social life. And ideally is to get as many people, if not all people, on the same page. So replacing members, teaching new members, producing, distributing consumer goods and services, really big emphasis on preserving order and trying to give people on the same page. One ways to talk about that is to say, like, have everyone have a similar idea of what the purpose or the value or what needs to be achieved here. So again, there's debates, and in fact, we live in 2026 now, where almost none of these are uncontested. Education is contested, health is contested, criminal justice has been contested for a while, economy is contested, family as an institution is contested. So none of these are uncontested institutions anymore. There's disagreements. There's large swaths of the populations who disagree about what the purpose and role of these institutions are. And so they don't serve the same functions as they used to in a more homogeneous time period where there was a lot more agreement. It's not like they weren't debates, but there was a lot more broad sense agreement about what role these needed to play. The definitions for social interaction is that it's the way in which we act and respond to other people around us. And really, the two kind of key concepts covered in your lecture that you cover in your text, you'll want to make sure you absorb, is the distinction between statuses and roles. The status is the social position you occupy as a student, as a son or daughter, as an employee, as a friend, as an athlete or a team member on a sports team, all the different social positions you occupy. These are statuses. It's not status in this context as high status or low status, but it's a recognized social positions that you occupy. And the roles are all the things that you do in order to fulfill these statuses. So all the different things that you do as a student, as an employee, as a son or daughter, or a brother or sister, or a parent, all the things that you do in order to fulfill these different positions, these social positions, those are the roles that you perform. So your text then ends up going over things like role conflict and the moments where statuses become in conflict with one another, and the changes in statuses over time, and the changes in the nature of the role over time, meaning that what it means to be a good student now versus 20 years ago, what it means to be a good employee now versus 15 or 20 years ago. they change. The roles that you need to perform change in order to maintain these social positions. But at the heart of all of it is the notion of norm. Norm is at its simplest, and we're going to dive more deeply into this a little bit later this semester because it's the heart of sort of norms is the heart of the discussion on deviance. But really, when we're talking about norm, we're talking about how you're supposed to how you're supposed to act, how you're supposed to feel, how you're supposed to be in this particular context. Norms is a generally accepted. Some norms are very strong and they have sort of an oppressive sort of presence in our lives where like people are resisting them, but they're really overwhelming. There's norms that are taken for granted that people don't resist at all because everyone they know, every stranger they meet kind of follows this norm, minus a few exceptions. Some norms are prescriptive or prescriptive, right? Prescriptive norms are things you're expected to do. Prescriptive norms are things that you're expected not to do. So, you're not, if this was a physical classroom, an example of proscriptive norms would be, standing up in class and starting to dance, standing up in class and running to the front of the room and trying to wrestle the mic away from me. There's usually that's a taken for granted. You don't need to be convinced of that. We don't have to talk people out of doing that. It's a pretty, it's a pretty generally accepted set of prescriptive norms that are at play in these contexts. And you can look at any social situations, you and friends, you and acquaintances, you and coworkers, you and family members, you and strangers, as you move through the city, as you move through where you live. Um, all of these social situations have these norms that are at play. And part of coming into a new situations is being exposed to norms you're not familiar with. It's being exposed to something that you don't have there. So somebody is asking in a DM whether or not this is connected, for example, to the notion of common sense. And absolutely it is. The idea of the common sense is the idea of something that's really widely shared among large sets of people that it doesn't need to be said out loud. And common sense is no longer common sense when you come across someone who does something else. And then you're like, well, wait a second, what's going on here? Now, if it doesn't affect you and it's not in your immediate surrounding, it's not a friend, a family member, or whoever, you may say, this person lacks common sense. Like they should have known better. But common sense starts to break down and you starts to have like an erosion of the social order when people are no longer on the same page. When you enter a social situation and you don't know how to act, you don't know what to say. You don't, and not only do you not know what to say, but the other people around you also don't seem to not know what to say. If everybody else knows what to say and what to do and you don't, that's because you're an outsider to this situation. You're new to the work, you're new to that social space, you've never gone to this kind of party or this kind of outing or this kind of event. And now you're picking up your cues from other people about how you're supposed to be. But if everybody else is confused around you, then we have a situation where common sense is no longer applicable. We have a novelty. So, an environmental disaster, a crisis, a something that takes place, you're in a war-torn country in the early days where it hasn't become like the new normal. Hopefully, it never does, but that does happen. It doesn't become the new normal yet, and everyone is uncertain and fearful and don't know what to do. Are norms almost secretly forced upon us? That's a good question. I mean, the norms aren't, it's not secret. Um, Secret's not quite the right word. I don't mind that, Gina, but it's not quite the right word because norms are very much explicitly enforced by parents, by siblings, by teachers, by sources of authority around you. You join a social situation and you're new to it. Those other people that are there are enforcing norms. They may not be doing so by using the word norm, of course, or by saying like Jaina, you need to stop acting this way and act that way. But they're the low level acceptance, the low level recrimination, the low level, the look of disgust, the look of surprise, the look of like, what are you doing? The pushback on people who do things that are not acceptable in all these little small ways. All of these create an environment where human beings become really, really good. Not all, but many human beings become really, really good at picking up on these very subtle cues. So is it secret? I mean, there's an aspect of it. We can talk about secrecy in the sense that, it's not always spoken out loud. A bunch of it can be unspoken or can be passed on kind of more implicitly, but it's not secret in the sense that, and we could talk about secrets as in, a special group that have their own inside language. You and some friends that belong to a group may have your own speak, your own language, your own code, your own ways of sort of behaving around one another that other people wouldn't necessarily understand or pick up on. So, and if you're doing that and purposely and you're protecting that because you're protecting the in group, and what you have special among one another, then yeah, there's an element of secret in there. But I think that it's just it's just mildly applicable as the term secret. It's almost like you need slightly off sort of synonyms left and right in order to make that there. If you want to join a social scene that you're new to, the people who are already there may enforce. Absolutely, 100%. And the strength of the norm dictates how well they're enforcing this on you. If it's a norm that is very, 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 very shallow, very loose, um, you show up to a new group and you've got, you dyed your hair and you got an extra tattoo and you're wearing, a t-shirt, and whatever, and people are like, yeah, I mean, looks cool, or they don't react at all, or they just like, yeah, that's what she's wearing, then it's not a heavily enforced norm. But you get into a different context, maybe it's an employer and they're like, what did you do? Like, that does not represent what we're doing here. Like, this is not like, I didn't think I needed to say this, but this is you need to dress better. You need to this you can't be turning your hair in that color and work here. Like, the more the norm is at play, the more it's important in that context, the more likely that people will say something and enforce it. Yes, 100%. There's different levels of norms, folkways, mores, and taboos. Taboos are the most sacred, the most serious. Taboos are the ones where oftentimes they're the norms that they want everybody to follow and nobody to stray from. It doesn't mean there's no exceptions, but if it's a taboo, then it's something that's usually quite shocking. And so societies, cultural groups have taboos, oftentimes tied to either sacred symbols or sacred beliefs of the group. And then some of them are, if not fully universal, are have much more universality around them. For example, the taboo of um, of intimate relationships between adults and children, or between adults who share a lineage, for example, siblings or first cousins and things like that. Those are some of the taboos that have the most universal purchase. It's not quite the right word, but who are considered a taboo across most, if not all, cultural groups. So yeah, cannibalism is a good one. Yeah, so yeah, you never get to a point where 100% of the cultural groups, from an historical perspective, have always had the exact same taboos. You'll oftentimes be able to find some edge cases. So the way you can think on it is like 97, 98, 99% of cultures don't think I have a taboo of one particular thing. It's near universal. We can't talk about it as universal, but it's near universal. Cannibalism would fall under that as well. There's some of the big ones. Murder, truthfully, is also high on the list. I mean, it happens a lot more, presumably, than cannibalism, but killing people defined as murder, which usually is not, there's categories of self-defense, there's in the employment of your work, if you're fighting a war or if you're in law enforcement, but like the idea of killing someone without like a proper justification, that is also widely considered taboo across multiple cultures. So norms influence us. Sometimes we notice, sometimes we don't notice. The most taken for granted set of norms are the ones that we picked up, again, in the realm of habits that we don't pay attention to unless we're confronted with something else, right? For, more not personal, huge personal, but like examples I can think of in my life where you have new roommates, people you live, who you see in not just, a few minutes here and there, or only in one context, but you see them across the whole day, how they sleep, how they eat, how they take care of their hygiene, how how they maintain every aspect of sort of the personal home front. And you see things you're not used to. You're like, oh, wait a second, like small things. This is not how I was raised to do it, or this is not, I didn't realize anybody did it this way. And there's some really kind of funny popular culture moments where large swaths of people realize that there's a whole set of other human beings out there who do some things that they've never thought of in a very different way, having to do again with how they take care of themselves, how they prepare food, how they wash themselves, all kinds of things like that. So you're exposed, it's taken for granted until you have a little human being you're teaching who doesn't know how to do it. And then you realize it's not taken for granted, they have to learn it. Or somebody is new to a culture or is new to environment, or you just have an exposure to somebody who does it in a different way, and then you have to do it. So when we've talked about secrets, we've talked about taboos, we've talked about prescriptive. The way really it's helpful to think on this is that it's a constraining pressure. You think about it as something that pushes people quietly, sometimes forcefully, other times, but pushes people to do things in a particular way. It does not mean that you don't have an ability right now, if you chose to go and have a conversation with a roommate or a family member where you decide to break half a dozen norms, in 5 minutes. How you talk to your roommate or parents, what you say to them, like what you decide to share, how you decide to share, how you decide to stand, how you decide to use your hand. Like there's numerous things you could be doing in your next conversation if you wanted to break norms on purpose, intentionally, you could do that. But most of the time, people don't do that unless they're having a laugh, or they're doing it for an experiment. And most of the time, the order and the stability comes from the fact that people are behaving in these expected ways. So while the norms are not universals, norms change over time. There are norms everywhere, and it is fundamental to how social order is maintained. And because it's norms and expectations is fundamental how social order is maintained, and because social order is one of the most critical question for sociology, how is society possible? How is a family possible? How is a workplace possible? How is a group of friends, lasting for years, if not decades, possible? Norms is at the very heart of that. It's right in the middle of that. It's one of these sort of most important things. So when we talk about social orders, we're talking about patterns. We're talking about how the everyday life, this is go back to sort of the social web, spider web picture I showed in the very first class. There's a lot of regularity to so much of our social context. It's part of what Garfinkel discusses as what's called a background expectancy. Background expectancy means that as you come into a new social situation, as you come into a social situation that is very familiar, both of those come with them with a whole set of common expectations. At home with your roommate or your family or your friends, like you have known them for a long time, so you know most of the time. Very little of what they tell you is like you're shocked, mouth wide open, like you can't believe this is like a stranger speaking to you. Like the regularity there comes from the familiarity. But this also applies to strangers. It also applies as you go to a movie theater, a classroom full of strangers, you go to a Starbucks or Tim Hortons full of strangers, you're driving through the streets of Toronto full of strangers. even in all these contexts full of strangers you have no history with, no relationship with, no knowledge about anything about their lives, and yet all of these strangers are moving about the social space you're in a way that allows you to also move through these spaces with a great deal of certainty about what's happening. And that doesn't mean that there isn't instances of surprise. There isn't instances where somebody does something where you're like, well, wait a second, that was unexpected. But that is the exception, not the rule. Most of the time, we are surrounded and we are operating in contexts full of strangers, and yet the pattern is still there. So Garfinkel talks about this as background expectancies, and he talks about this as essentially a form of trust. And it's strange because it's not the same trust as in like I trust my mom or I trust my dad or I trust my best friend or I trust my wife. It's not that type of trust built on like a deep personal relationship over time. I trust to tell them everything. I trust them with my life. I trust. It's not that. And yet, it's still a version of that because as you, for example, drive through the city of Toronto or walk through the city of Toronto, you're trusting that people who have these vehicles aren't going to come out for you on the sidewalks and run over you as you're crossing the street or run over you left and right. You're trusting that you don't have, as you're sitting in a queue for your concert or for your coffee, need to constantly watch for danger from the people in front of you and the people ahead of you, that who's the next person who's going to pull a knife and is going to try to stab me. Now, mind you, not everyone has the same sense of security, and there are definitely social situations, lots of social situations where people are fearful for danger and are fearful of strangers. But there is a base level trust that exists for lots of folks, that until that trust is broken, until that trust is removed, until there's like something that happens that says, I can no longer trust strangers. This is what happened to me a week ago. This is what happened to me 2 years ago. This is what happened to me 5 years ago. And then your trust in strangers is not irrevocably, but it's fundamentally shifted. You no longer can trust because something pretty big happened that put you in danger, that hurt you, that harmed someone you know. Oftentimes, before that happens, people have this low level trust in these hundreds of thousands of strangers whose lives intersect with yours. And that trust is there in those social relationships. And the fact that the bank teller is not, is when you give them money at the bank, isn't taking it and putting in their own bank account, but they're putting it in your bank account. You're trusting all of these strangers that they're doing what they're supposed to do until they've given you a chance not to. And I don't want to be like so definitive that says like, oh, you have it and then you lose it, or you have it until you lose it. But you're like empirically, most of the time, most people, and there's levels to it, like have a low level of trust towards people around them. And yet, when there's situations have warranted that trust can no longer be applied, you've seen somebody get pushed in the TTC too close for comfort, that you no longer feel like there's hundreds of people here lining up with me for the next subway. Like I'm not standing anywhere close to the ledge. It only takes one person to do something stupid and push me, and I like the consequences are so big. I'm putting my back on the wall, and I'm making it very difficult for anybody to move me, if even if they wanted to. Like these are not the most typical example. I'm trying to come up with examples, sort of moments where that trust wouldn't be there, but the default is that it's there. So lining up in queues, merging up on the highway, pedestrian crossing the street, those are examples. And the reason that that's there, the reason that that trust exists, is the reason we can talk about social order, that we can talk about how the patterns are there. We can talk about how the expectations in the everyday life are sort of present. And when that's no longer there, when you have different groups of people in the same social situations, when there's been large scale changes to, let's say, the makeup of the people who live around where you are, when you've had instances, you've not just you personally, but to people you know or things you've heard in the news, where now like a person becomes no longer trustful, of the kind of the commonplace everyday background expectancies that people would bring, then you have somebody who no longer looks at themselves as being in a city that's or in a province or in a country that has an enormous amount of social order, but they live their lives in a state where they believe that the world has around every corner has a lot of danger. And I'm not saying that doesn't happen. In fact, again, in a 2026 context, there's a greater and greater proportion of the population who, and I'm not questioning the legitimacy of this, it could, for a very legitimate reason and maybe for misinformation reasons, believe that the city and the province and the country they're in are not safe. And they no longer trust people, strangers, and they no longer trust being in social spaces. And they minimize their exposure to that and they minimize the amount of time they spent around strangers because they don't believe that social order is at play. Fundamentally, for sociologists, that continues to place these issues at the very heart. Because when people see that as present versus people don't see that as present, how does an erosion of social order play out in day-to-day life? What are the consequences of that? How does that get repaired? Is that even possible once it's been eroded? That's really, really kind of key. And this is fundamentally when I talked about polarization and a group of people who may not think that we live in an orderly sort of society. What we're really fundamentally talking about is the social construction of reality, which teaching on this 20 years ago was a little bit harder than now. Now, in a way, it's the easiest it's ever been because you have large segments of the populations who fundamentally see the world in a different way. Um, it's easier, it's more crystal clear in our neighbors down south because the level of polarization there is more extreme than it is in Canada, but it's definitely present in Canada. Different groups of people across, for example, the political spectrum who interpret events, who interpret what is real and not real, what happened or didn't happen, who have fundamental disagreements on the facts of any given situations. They have a completely different conception of reality than one another. And so the social construction of reality is an old term in sociology. It's not quite 100 years old, but it's more than 70 years old now that it was coined by symbolic interactionists to talk about how our experience of reality is very much shaped. This is back again, Bourdieu took this and talked about it in the habitus context, but our the way we see the world is shaped by our experiences. And we act on the reality that we see. We act on the reality that we think is real. If we don't think something is real, this I talked about this in the very first class, then we don't respond to things in the same way. And so we have disagreements in this country about what the problems are, about what the crises are, about what the issues that need to be solved. And because of that, people are not on the same page, not just about what the solutions to adopt, but they're fundamentally disagreeing on identifying the issues, on identifying what might be wrong or what might need tinkering, and so on and so forth. So the social construction of reality is at the heart of what sociologists do. Um, you for a long time we've talked about in social science the dominant group and their impact on the social construction of reality. They get oftentimes to determine and perpetuate their own sense of reality through the education, through media. Those are two important ones, not the only ones, but education and media, and then the other institutions in society that are reflective of how they see the world. And now, if you're in a group that's not part of that dominant group, they may be whole layers of your own reality, of your own experiences that is not recognized, that's not visible, that's not talked about, that's not covered, that's not discussed, that the media doesn't pay any attention to, that the laws are not responsive to, and so on and so forth. So this is contested. It's more contested than ever. And in fact, when we talk about media, the very next class on Wednesday, we'll talk about the fragmentation of media and how now, because there's more different sources of media, it's accelerated this sort of multiplicity of social construction of reality. Because people are getting their news and their information from a wider array of sources than never gone before. So we're not the majority of the population is no longer reading the same one or two or three newspapers or watching the same one or two or three news shows at the end of the day that gives them a layer of this is what happened today in this city or in this province or in this country. People are getting their news from all kinds of places. And because of that, they're aware of different kinds of events, and they also are their sense of what is real and what's happening out there is fundamentally impacted by that. So that's very much a media story and a social construction of reality story. We're gonna touch on that just in a couple of days. I've got a couple more pieces here. I don't know that um, I'm gonna get to all of it in the next kind of 4 minutes. Um, all of this is covered in one matter and the other in your text, but ethnomethodology, that's Garfinkel. It's one approach, it's one method within sociology that tries to study what I've been talking about the last half hour, which is sort of this common sense. That a student brought that up first, kind of common sense knowledge, this sort of taken for granted knowledge, taken for granted norms that exist. Ethnomethodologies are the ones who are most interested in studying that. And one of the ways in which they study that is called breaching experiment. And breaching experiment is in order to find out what these norms are, what these background expectancies are, they break them on purpose and then they measure and they observe the reaction that people have. This isn't about like you unintentionally having said something that got a reaction, 2 weeks ago or 2 years ago or whatever. This is about like purposely, with care, breaking a norm and then watching and analyzing and observing and writing what the responses are. And doing that over and over again and looking for patterns. If you wanted to engage in something like that as a sort of as an experiment, as a thought experiment, as an experiment, for example, you could take there's three examples that I provide here. How are you is one of them, right? It's usually commonly used as a greeting. And yet, if somebody asks you how you are, anybody that gets that next person that says how are you, that you're passing through a hallway, you're passing through in your house, you're passing through in the streets, you stop and you give them a full-throated answer of how you're feeling and how you're doing in that moment. You tell them like what you're stressed about right now, what's concerning you, the things you're excited about, like the things that you're mulling over, the things that kept you up last night. You tell them how you are. I mean, they ask, right? But instead of treating it as the greeting, it usually is. And when then we use context clue when we realize somebody's, is asking us how we're doing and they really want the real answer, you provide the real answer in context that wouldn't be expected. And that's an example of norm breaking. You act like a guest at your home. If you're still living with, your siblings or parents or caretakers, you treat the people there like they were an employee at a hotel. Do that for, any length of time, a few minutes, an hour, a couple of hours, see what the reactions are. Violating personal space. This is a old one, but good one. Don't break the law and don't stalk people. Don't creep on people. Let's just be clear here. Violating personal space in a sort of trivial way. You're getting into an elevator, and rather than standing in the right opposite of where they are, you're standing pretty close to them. Or rather than facing the door, you're facing them, or you're sitting in a bus or sitting in a subway or sitting in a movie theater and there's like dozens of seats available, you sit next to someone. Those are all low level, small levels of sort of violating personal space. And the reason they're considered that is because they break norms. That's not what is supposed to happen in these situations. That's the point of the breaching experiment. Okay, so that leaves, I'm not gonna run through it. I'm gonna think about how to get that content to you. I'm probably gonna record a short sort of 5-minute supplemental lecture on dramaturgical analysis and sociology of emotions. They're the last two slides I'm not gonna get to today. The reflection, which has no deadline, is here for this lecture. Take one concept from today, any concept you want from the lecture, explain it in your own words, and analyze a situation in your life or everyday social interactions using that concept. Again, there's no deadline for it until further notice. And then what we have on Wednesday is mass media. Tomorrow, I will distribute the instructions for the AI assignment, so keep an eye for that. Otherwise, that's the end of lecture. I will stick around for any and all questions you may have. And you are, obviously, this is recorded. I will make it available when I can. But I will be here for the next hour and chat up. So again, part of me feels like I should be apologizing for all the troubles that are out there. Obviously, it has nothing to do with me, but we're going to do what we can. And I use the word trust in this lecture. I'm going to say, you don't know me, but I will do my very best so that you feel you can trust that we're not we're gonna do what's right and what's fair and make sure that all of you can have a successful semester. So you enjoy the rest of your day. I will see you on Wednesday. I will stick around for an hour for those who want to chat. Enjoy the afternoon out there. Cheers. Thank